Remember the viral video of the kid getting a Nintendo 64 on Christmas from a few years back? Well, now imagine snatching the Nintendo away from the kid after he played with it for approximately 2 minutes. That'd be pretty cruel, right? Well, that's exactly how Missouri basketball fans felt after hearing the news that Michael Porter Jr. is likely out for the entire season with a back injury. In their grief, some Missouri fans have been wondering if Porter might come back for another season. After all, Porter had publicly entertained the thought of playing more than one season before having surgery, so why wouldn't he be even more likely to do so now? Frankly, few potential top 5 NBA draft picks have more incentive to play in college than Porter. For one, his brother Jonte frankly should be a senior in high school, but he reclassified this year to play with his brother Michael. Both guys, Jonte and Michael's father, Michael Porter Sr., is an assistant at Missouri. Also, their sisters have played on the Missouri women's team for a few years, which is coached by their aunt, Robin Pinchton. Obviously, the Porters are a very close-knit group, and they're all pretty much here in Columbia. Second, playing 2 minutes in college is obviously not ideal. There will be questions about Michael's back that could possibly linger until he plays against high-level competition in real games. And finally, as a Columbia native, Michael's talked a lot about leaving a legacy at Mizzou.
Don't do as well as I believe we can do as a team, but I still do great individually and projected top 5, top 3, whatever. I don't know if I would go. I might come back just because like I said, I want to leave a legacy and help the team get back on course. So it's not for sure one way or the other. But I mean, everybody thinks I'm not serious when I say that. But I actually might spend more than 1 year in college.
And yet, in spite of all this, I think Michael is as good as gone to the NBA, and the reason started before he was even born. NBA Commissioner Adam Silver recently said that the NBA's one-and-done system is, quote, not working for anyone. I, for one, wholeheartedly agree with that statement, but we must first acknowledge what created the so-called problem in the first place. Before one-and-done was a problem, high school players were considered a problem. But just how truly big of a problem were high school players entering the draft, and how has the NBA done in dissuading younger players entering the league? Starting with the 2006 NBA draft, so-called high school players were not eligible to be drafted. Currently, as in today, players must be 19 or 1 year removed from their high school graduating class to be eligible. Prior to 2006, players declaring for the draft after their freshman season of college, that was a pretty rare occasion. Now, you might famously remember Carmelo Anthony and Chris Bosh being taken as freshmen in the top 5 in 2003, but you probably don't remember that they were the only 2 freshmen taken in that draft. Contrast that with this past June, where 16 freshmen, or, quote, one-and-done players, were taken, plus several international prospects who were about in that same 19-year-old age range. In essence, the NBA traded one supposed problem, too many high school players, for another, too many one-and-done players. But let's add some more context. How prevalent were high school players prior to 2006? In the previously mentioned 2003 draft, there was also this guy.
With the first pick in the 2003 NBA draft, the Cleveland Cavaliers select LeBron James.
James was one of 5 high school players drafted that year. So if we add those 5 guys with our 2 freshmen, 7 is still far short of the 16 one-and-done American players taken in 2017. I'd also note that the year before James was drafted, 2002, Amari Stoudemire was the lone high school player taken, and DeJuan Wagner was the only freshman selected. In 1995, Kevin Garnett opened the floodgates of high school players. I said that sarcastically because Garnett was the first high school player taken in the NBA draft in 20 years, since Darryl Dawkins and Bill Willoughby were each selected in the 1975 draft. Prior to Garnett, Reggie Harding and Sean Kemp also never played in college, but they were drafted a year after their high school graduating classes, making them much more akin age-wise to one-and-done players. So why was there this 20-year gap between so-called high school draftees? The prevailing conventional NBA wisdom for years was that younger players, particularly ones who hadn't attended college, were too physically and mentally immature to withstand the rigors of professional basketball. And in fact, the league generally barred players from the league until 4 entire years after their high school graduating class. That is, until Mr. Spencer Haywood came around. You see, in 1970, Haywood won the Most Valuable Player and Rookie of the Year awards for the American Basketball Association, the NBA's pro basketball competitor at the time. Unlike the NBA, the ABA had no age restrictions, so Haywood was free to enter the ABA despite leaving college after his sophomore year. But after a contract dispute with the ABA's Denver Rockets, who later became the Nuggets, Haywood signed with the NBA's Seattle Supersonics after his one season in the ABA. Unsurprisingly, the NBA was unwilling to make an exception for Spencer Haywood, and with the Supersonics' support, Haywood filed an antitrust suit against the league, where he ultimately prevailed 7-2 in, yes, this United States Supreme Court. And the result of that? Well, players could now make a hardship case to enter the league early, which was essentially a personal financial assessment by the league. Sport magazine writer Jackie Lappin said of hardship cases, quote, "Almost anyone who was any good at the game in the past decade would qualify, with the probable exception of Bill Bradley, the banker's son." I would also add that Bradley later became a U.S. Senator, just for some good trivia for you. Now, while Haywood's win led to many underclassmen entering the draft, as previously mentioned, only 2 high schoolers preceded Kevin Garnett in the NBA. In his classic book, Breaks of the Game, David Halberstam writes of Sidney Wicks, quote, "Perhaps he was a victim of the new world of guaranteed contracts, which deprived young players of adequate motivation," end quote. This was published in 1981, but it could just as easily have been said by Charles Barkley in 2018. It seems like the more things change, the more they stay the same, and we're going to see more examples of this going forward. While the NBA is ostensibly a competitive, free market enterprise, there is an element of coercion that limits players' choices, albeit nothing like you see that comes from the government. Obviously, no one forces anybody to join the NBA. Nevertheless, professional sports teams are unique from other businesses because all the teams in the league are separate competitive entities, but also, by necessity, the teams are all bound by the same self-imposed rules. However, and this is a really key point, it would be incorrect to assume that the owners wield all of the power. While the NBA Players Union had formed 10 years prior in 1954, it wasn't until the 1964 All-Star Game that the players truly had and used any leverage. Without getting too deep into a labor dispute from 50 plus years ago, the Players Union had disputes about working conditions and pensions, and most of the union members felt the owners had been putting off addressing those concerns for years. At the time, you see there were 9 teams compared to 30 today, scant broadcast coverage, and almost every player had a day job in the off-season. But the league was slowly but surely gaining popularity in the biggest markets, and for the first time ever, here in 1964, ABC was televising the All-Star Game live in prime time. The players, led by Union President and Boston Celtic Tommy Heinsohn, were boycotting the game and refusing to come out of the locker room. When word of the boycott got back to ABC, they threatened to pull the game. Bob Short, the Los Angeles Lakers owner at the time, was absolutely furious, but his attempts to force his way into the locker room failed. Instead, Short gave a little message to a cop posted outside of the door. And that message was basically this: "Hey, I'm Bob Short, the owner of the Lakers. You tell Elgin Baylor if he doesn't get out of here fast, I'm done with him. Well, when Mr. Baylor heard of this, he replied, you tell Bob Short to go fuck himself. And with that rather succinct statement, NBA Players Union leverage is born. While nothing was made official that night, the owners essentially caved, and with a few minutes to spare, the game was played. Indeed, while the owners are the wealthier part of this equation, they know they don't have a league without the players. So any rule changes must be collectively bargained between the league and the Players Union. When the differences aren't able to be ironed out, lockouts and strikes happen. Current players in the union clearly negotiate with their own self-interests in mind. However, because these collective bargaining agreements last for multiple seasons, in essence, the union leaders are negotiating on behalf of players that are not yet in the league. So getting back to self-interest here, does Chris Paul, the current president of the NBA Players Association, have the same interests as Missouri's Michael Porter Jr., who has yet to enter the league? Clearly, the owners weren't the only ones worried about young players entering the league. In the veteran players' mind, they were perfectly justified in taking a larger percentage of money than younger players. See, in their minds, they had earned it. On this, the players' union, coaches, and owners were all happy to agree. But while Kevin Garnett may have started the trend of younger and younger players entering the league, the one-and-done rule, I would remind you, did not start until 2006. However, one and done was not the first attempt to control young players in the post-Spencer Haywood era. Michael Jordan's incredible popularity and the rise of cable TV nationwide brought unprecedented eyeballs and dollars to the NBA. The interest from those years not only made Jordan wealthy beyond anyone's wildest imagination, it made the NBA overall a cash cow. Naturally, much of the new revenue and profits from this expansion were invested back into the business, with the biggest beneficiaries being the players themselves. Amusingly, though, some of the old guard were concerned that this windfall for the young players was unearned and a case of too much too soon. Getting back to Charles Barkley in 1994, he said, if you're working and somebody comes right in and doubles and triples your salary, it's not fair. What did Grant Hill get? 9 years, $45 million? That's $2 million more than I got. Something is wrong. Note that Hill played for 4 years at Duke, but even that was not enough to prevent Barkley from counting somebody else's money. I'd also note that despite Hill's eventual career-altering foot injuries, Hill would go on to make 7 All-Star games from that point forward versus Barkley's 3. So guess what, Charles? Captain Hindsight says Hill should have got more money than you.
Well, looks like my job here is done. Goodbye, everyone!
Thank you, Captain Hindsight!
Thank you!
But it was that type of attitude from the players and owners that gave us the rookie salary cap, which you could more accurately call rookie slotting. While an overall salary cap also existed, rookies, starting with the 1995 draft, had their pay predetermined based on where they were selected. Of course, in reality, no two players are equal, but the NBA has treated all number 1 overall picks, for instance, the same for more than 20 years. If the league and players' union goal was to limit rookie compensation, then mission accomplished. Congratulations. However, if capping rookie money was supposed to keep players in college longer, it had the exact opposite effect. Now, young players are trying to get their first rookie contract out of the way as quickly as possible in order to get to that second contract, where a player can receive multiple relatively unfettered offers from several teams and thus make a lot more money. Naturally, players would rather start making more money sooner rather than later. Michael Porter Jr. has been telling people he might come back to Missouri if the team doesn't accomplish its goals this season, and yet the sports community doesn't really believe him. But why can't he be like Tim Duncan and Grant Hill? If Porter, for the sake of discussion, were the likely first pick despite his back injury, then he has no financial incentive to prolong his journey to the NBA. However, if NBA rookie contracts were unrestrained, then in theory, even though you can't get drafted any higher than first, you could still make yourself more valuable than you were the previous year. In that scenario, perhaps guys will stay longer in school in order to get that first contract instead of worrying about getting to the second one. After all, once again, money today is always preferable to the same money tomorrow. To recap, the NBA and its players collectively decided that the league was getting too young. But the result of one and done, coupled with limiting salaries via the rookie cap, has caused even more young players to enter the draft than ever before. Based on their own stated goals, the NBA and the Players Union have failed spectacularly in this goal. Now, don't get me wrong, I understand the league's desire. Legendary coach John Thompson said the 22 hours a day Allen Iverson would not be playing basketball, quote, scare the hell out of me, end quote. And that was after Iverson's sophomore year. Thompson's concerns were ultimately validated in many ways, but my question would be, would 1 or 2 more years in college have made that huge of a difference? Frankly, who can say? We've seen this hand-wringing about players that are, quote, too young and immature, entering the league too soon for decades. What we're ultimately arguing about is values, which are all subjective. Tim Duncan played 4 years of college ball, and LeBron James played 0. Who is right? Veteran reporter David Teal once said Duncan was, quote, the exception. Had Duncan elected to come out last year or this, he would have been the draft's #1 pick. But Duncan hails from the Virgin Islands, where he was a humbled swimmer, not a spoiled basketball star. He is elected to return to Wake Forest for his 4th year. The money, Duncan said, can wait. He's having too much fun in college. Oh, isn't that wonderful? Well, obviously Mr. Teal prefers Duncan's approach, but Duncan and James both ended up as Hall of Fame caliber players, 2 of the 10, 15 greatest players of all time. So it's obvious to me that they were, in hindsight, both right in making their very different decisions. My contention is that decisions should be up to each individual player. Owners, coaches, and current players trying to impose their subjective values on young players is not only self-motivated, it also hasn't worked out how they planned. Certainly people do not react to newfound wealth, success, or fame in the same way. But there was no shortage of what people at the time called attitude problems during the cocaine-plagued 1970s and 80s when the hardship rule reigned supreme. Even the most mature players enter the league in their early 20s. Young men who suddenly come into unprecedented wealth will experience the challenges that go along with that, such as, who can I trust with this money? Who are my real friends when so many of them are asking for a loan?
I guess this means more money, more problems for you.
Yeah, I guess so. More money, more problems. It's just the way it is.
By all means, let's talk about these issues. Let's better understand the human condition. Let's realize that whatever our problems are, money is not going to solve them unless your problem is literally solvable by money, like paying off your student loans or something. See, a lot of people have that carrot dangling in front of them. They think, oh, I don't feel satisfied or happy, but just wait until I get rich and then by golly, everything will be great. Unfortunately, when a lot of people do get rich, especially beyond their wildest imaginations, and they're still unsatisfied in some way, see, that's where problems can really start in. That's when you get your drugs, your alcohol, your too much partying, your depression, etc., etc., etc. We've all heard the story, right? However, I have absolutely no idea why either delaying the inevitable by 1 year or having a young man who is used to living in poverty making only $7 million a year versus $25 million a year, for instance, is going to dramatically change his mentality. Is $7 million a year not enough for a guy to get himself into trouble? I'd argue that it's plenty. Of course, many of the NBA's talking heads are advocating for different forms of control than one and done. Perhaps we should make them wait 2 years or until they're 20. Or maybe it should be like the baseball situation where guys can leave after high school, or if they decide to go to college, then they have to wait 3 years. Well, I'm not advocating for any of that. I'm not only advocating for the elimination of all salary caps and the age limit, I'm also advocating for the abolishment of the draft. Yes, that's right, you heard me. Let's go nuts. If players will not sign with a franchise voluntarily outside of the draft, perhaps something is amiss with that franchise. Also, if you think a guy who has never played an NBA game being its highest paid player is crazy, it has happened before. When Wilt Chamberlain joined the Philadelphia Warriors, he immediately became the NBA's highest paid player, making about $30,000 in his rookie contract. Considering Wilt averaged 37 points and 27 rebounds that first year, I'd say the Warriors got their money's worth. And this previously unprecedented expenditure did not fold the franchise nor the league. During the rookie salary debate of the 1990s, Knicks coach Pat Riley said, quote, "Guys are signing for 15 years and for 12 years, and it sounds like a lot of money, but you've got to give them something. I'll bet you 10 years from now, you look at the average bases for some of these guys, and they're going to look very, very, very low. All it is a big number. All of them have performance outs after a year or two. So they give them security. They give them 15 years. God, they won't be around that long, some of them. But they're going to renegotiate short-term deals in a couple years." Riley was wise enough to realize that today's overpay can look like tomorrow's bargain in the future when circumstances change. And indeed, most young players are artificially more valuable than ever, while the most valuable veteran players are artificially undervalued. Let's stop this insanity and let price discovery, also known as the unfettered negotiation process, work its magic, and believe me, the league will be much better off for it.